The salespeople's eyes dissected her in less than 3 seconds. A quick, brutal assessment that began at the faded coat, slid down the plain pants, and landed on the shoes that carried silent stories of miles walked through school corridors and community center yards. Sophia felt the judgment before she even finished passing through the automatic doors of the luxury dealership, an invisible weight that always clung to clothes chosen not for style, but for practicality. Clothes for someone who spent her days on her knees at children's eye level, staining fabric with finger paint and leftover snacks. She was crossing the threshold between two parallel universes. On one side, the world she inhabited every day, steeped in the sweet smells of crayons, lunch boxes, and the salty sweat of children after recess. On the other, this temple of consumption, where the air smelled of new leather, polished ambition, and an expensive silence that probably cost more per square meter than the entire monthly budget of her community center. Her mission was mundane: pick up Miguel's silver sedan for its annual service, a responsibility that usually fell to neatly dressed assistants but which, in her husband's absence on a corporate trip, had landed on her shoulders. The gleaming car waited in one of the bays, an object as alien to her daily universe as diamonds in a miner's calloused hands. The first salesperson who approached had a trained smile that never reached his eyes. His smooth movements froze for a split second as he evaluated her. He began to speak, his words forming polite sentences that suggested she was in the wrong place, that perhaps she was looking for the back entrance, that the used car section was in another wing. Sophia caught the disconnect between his courteous tone and the underlying message, a quiet narrative about her place in the world, or rather, about her lack of a place in that particular space. She tried to explain, but her words seemed to lose weight as they collided with the perfumed air conditioning of the dealership. While she talked, she noticed other salesmen exchanging meaningful glances, small contained smiles, subtle nods that communicated more than any direct sentence. A well-dressed couple walked in, and the salesman's attention shifted instantly, his body literally turning like a compass needle swinging toward the true north of potential buyers. Minutes dragged by. Sophia remained standing beside the silver sedan, an invisible specter among the polished shine of the vehicles. Salespeople passed by as if she were part of the decor, their quick glances running mental calculations that always ended in the same verdict: not worth the time. She watched one of them open the door of a convertible for a client, explaining its features with genuine enthusiasm, a tone he had never come close to using with her. The humiliation did not come in cruel words or direct insults. It arrived in the most subtle, and therefore most piercing, form: selective invisibility, a politeness that refused to see her as someone worthy of real attention, the eloquent silence that shouted its social verdict. Every minute in that dealership was a practical lesson in how the world assessed people by surface layers, discarding any possibility of depth beneath worn-out clothes. When she finally managed to get the minimum attention required to complete the paperwork for the service, the process was handled with a cold efficiency that made her feel like a number, not a person. She signed forms with the same hands that usually held colored pencils and helped tie shoelaces, her fingerprints leaving insignificant marks over fields designed for signatures of important people. As she left, she overheard a comment that was not directed at her but floated in the air like an involuntary confession about how that world worked. Someone spoke about dreams that did not sell cars, about appearances that spoke louder than realities. Those words followed her all the way to the parking lot, where the silver sedan waited like a sarcophagus of values she had never fully understood. She sat behind the wheel, her hands trembling slightly, not with anger, but with a deep sadness, less for the world that had rejected her and more for the world she had chosen to inhabit. She looked at her own clothes in the rearview mirror, the coat that had kept children warm on cold days, the pants that had knelt on concrete floors to soothe crying, the shoes that had chased giggles across schoolyards. In that moment, inside a car worth more than the entire annual budget of her community center. Sophia understood that she lived a duality few would ever grasp. She belonged to two worlds at once, and that day one of them had told her clearly that there was no place for people like her. The humiliation did not hurt because it wounded her pride, but because it confirmed something she had always suspected, that human worth was often measured by metrics that had nothing to do with a person's real substance. But those very clothes that the dealership salespeople had judged and dismissed in a matter of seconds carried, in their worn fibers, a story far more complex than any superficial glance could ever discern. As Sophia drove the luxury car back home, her hands still slightly trembling on the leather steering wheel, her mind did not fixate on the recent humiliation, but on the deeper reasons that led her to dress in exactly that way, day after day. Every piece of clothing was a page from an unwritten diary, a silent chronicle of conscious choices that shaped not only her wardrobe, but the entire architecture of her life. She ran a community center that served as a daily refuge for children facing difficult family situations. The place, in a neighborhood that many people in Miguel's social circle avoided even mentioning, functioned as an island of normalcy in an ocean of uncertainty. There, children who arrived with eyes tired from premature worries found not only food and activities, but something far more precious, the steady reassurance of a place where they were seen not for their circumstances, but for their unexplored potential. The salary Sophia had earned as a public school teacher, before dedicating herself fully to the project, was almost entirely reinvested in the center. She constantly ran numbers in her head. The price of a new coat equaled 20 packs of school supplies. A pair of fashionable shoes would buy milk for an entire month. An elegant dinner out could pay the center's electric bill for 6 weeks. These moral equations had become second nature to her, an inner value system that completely reconfigured her relationship with consumption and social status. The second-hand clothes she carefully chose at thrift stores and donation fairs were not a sign of lack, but a quiet philosophical statement. While Miguel spent on a single business suit the equivalent of the center's food budget for a quarter, Sophia had learned to find beauty in functionality, dignity in simplicity, wealth in the ability to do more with less. Every piece she wore carried the story of someone before her, and she honored that story by continuing a cycle of conscious use that challenged the disposable logic of modern consumption. There was one particular memory that always resurfaced in moments of doubt or judgment, as it did now while the silver sedan glided through the elegant streets of the neighborhood Miguel had chosen for its status, not for any connection to the community. It was the image of her father, a man with hands marked by physical labor and eyes that had seen more hardship than victory. He had died relatively young, not from a single illness, but from the cumulative wear of a life spent fighting to provide the basics for his family. His final words, whispered in a public hospital room where privacy was a rare luxury, had crystallized in Sophia's mind as a moral mandate. Do not let the world convince you that some people deserve more chances than others. Every child begins with the same right to a dignified future. That promise, made to her father on the threshold between life and death, had become the central axis around which every adult decision revolved. To her, the community center was not an act of charity in the conventional sense. It was something deeper, an attempt to create a moral counterweight to a system that so often denied to many children what it automatically guaranteed to others. Every meal served was an act of nutritional justice. Every tutoring session offered was an intervention against educational inequality. Every hug given to an overwhelmed mother was a recognition that the struggle for family dignity was a collective battle, not an individual one. The children who came to the center had names, stories, and distinct personalities that Sophia knew intimately. There was the 8-year-old boy who drew airplanes with remarkable precision, dreaming of becoming a pilot even though his current reality rarely extended beyond the boundaries of his neighborhood. The 10-year-old girl who cared for her younger siblings like a young mother, but who, at the center, allowed herself to play with dolls and reclaim fragments of an interrupted childhood. The shy teenager who had discovered in the center's modest book collection portals to worlds that his immediate reality would never show him. Sophia kept a mental journal of these stories, and every one of them influenced her daily choices. When she saw an elegant coat in a shop window, she did not think about how good it would look on her, but about how many children's stories might have happier endings if the cost of that coat were transformed into real resources. When Miguel's friends spoke about international trips or luxury purchases, she silently translated those expenses into months of the center's operation, into children who could be welcomed, into families that could receive support in critical moments. When she finally parked in the underground garage of the expensive building that felt more like Miguel's home than hers, Sophia turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the artificial silence inside the car. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel, the same hands that, earlier that morning, had helped a child tie shoelaces, handed out school supplies, and gently stroked the head of a boy crying because his parents had argued again. Then she looked at her clothes, truly looked this time, not with the shame she had felt at the dealership, but with a deep recognition of their symbolic meaning. The faded coat was not shameful, it was honorable. The simple pants were not a sign of poverty, they were proof of correct priorities. The worn shoes did not suggest carelessness, they traced the path of a life spent walking in directions few people chose to take. The humiliation she had felt at the dealership began to dissipate, replaced by a renewed clarity about who she was and why she made the choices she made. Her clothes were only the visible part of a much deeper commitment, the tip of the iceberg of a value system that privileged real impact over superficial impressions, substance over appearance, shared humanity over artificial social hierarchies. As she stepped out of the car, her hands no longer trembled. Instead, they held firmly the keys that would open the door of a luxury apartment that had never quite felt like home, but where, that night, she would sleep with the quiet certainty that no matter what the world thought of her clothes, she was wearing something far more valuable: moral conviction, genuine purpose, and the silent certainty that some battles are worth fighting, even when they mean being misunderstood by those who cannot see beyond the surface. Miguel's return brought an immediate shift in the apartment's atmosphere. He came in with his usual efficiency, but his analytical gaze picked up something different in Sophia before she even spoke. She recounted the humiliation at the dealership with clinical precision, watching his face close off, not in outrage, but in embarrassment. His reaction was revealing. He did not care about her pain, only about the breach of protocol. "You did not have to go alone," he said, his voice carrying reproof. "I have assistants for that." His words exposed the fundamental disconnect between them. For her, it was a matter of dignity. For him, it was a problem of image management. In the days that followed, tension crystallized in remarks that sounded like concern but carried a deeper criticism. Miguel questioned whether the work at the center still made sense, suggested more appropriate hobbies, mentioned other causes considered socially acceptable in his social circle. The threat was never stated openly, but it hung in the air. He could withdraw the discreet financial support that kept the center running. Sophia knew him well enough to read between the lines. She saw in his eyes the silent cost-benefit calculation he applied to every decision, now including her life choices. With every conversation, the gap between their moral universes grew clearer. She lived for purpose, he lived for appearances. The breaking point came during a quiet dinner. Miguel finally asked the question Sophia had felt approaching. "Have you ever considered that maybe you are sacrificing too much for people who will never truly appreciate what you do?" Those words unveiled the unspoken assumptions beneath everything he thought. That her work was sacrifice, not purpose. That the people she helped were incapable of genuine gratitude. That she was wasting her life on something that held no real value in his world. In that moment, Sophia watched the hairline crack between them widen into a chasm. Two sides. On one side, her core values and the promise made to her dying father. On the other, the man she loved, who did not understand, and perhaps would never understand, her reasons. The threat was no longer only against the center, but against her ability to remain who she was while staying beside someone who did not understand, and maybe would never understand, her choices. She looked out through the floor-to-ceiling window at the city lights, where every lit window represented a story as complex as her own, and she knew that soon she would have to make a choice that would divide her life into before and after. The question was no longer whether, but when, and how much of herself she would be willing to sacrifice, or to save, in the process. The conflict had escalated from external humiliation to an inner existential threat, and Sophia felt the weight of that transition in every breath, every exchanged glance, every silence that stretched between them in the apartment that had never truly felt like home. The night after that decisive dinner passed in silent wakefulness for Sophia. She wandered through the luxurious apartment that had never felt like a true home, touching expensive objects that represented values that were not her own, running her fingers over polished surfaces that reflected a life she had never truly chosen. Every room echoed with the absence of genuine meaning, a brutal contrast to the noisy, loving vitality of the community center, where every scratch on the wall and every stain on the floor told stories of lives being intensely lived. Sophia sat on the imported leather sofa that Miguel had chosen for status rather than comfort and closed her eyes. In her mind, she did not see the uncertain future awaiting her, but the past that had brought her to that point. She saw herself as a child again, watching her father leave for his third job of the day, his shoulders already bowed before the work even began, but his smile still present when he turned to wave goodbye. She remembered the promise she had made not only to him on his deathbed, but to herself, the promise that her life would mean more than accumulating possessions, that she would use her time on earth to reduce, even slightly, the kind of suffering that had marked her childhood. That promise had become her moral compass, the true north guiding every significant decision. She had kept it through years of quiet work while friends pursued lucrative careers, while Miguel climbed the corporate ladder, while the world around her praised achievements measured in bank balances and property sizes. Her reward came in different forms, in the spontaneous hug of a child who had finally learned to read, in the relieved smile of a mother who found work through the center's network, in the calm satisfaction she felt at the end of each day, knowing that she had made a tangible difference, however small, in real lives. Now that same promise placed her in front of the hardest choice of her adult life. On one side was Miguel, the man she had loved, with whom she had shared years, whose values she finally admitted were fundamentally incompatible with her own. On the other side was her purpose, her work, the 200 children who depended on the center not only for food and activities, but for the silent message that someone in the world cared about their well-being, believed in their potential, and saw beyond their circumstances. The choice was not simply between a man and a cause. It was between two versions of herself. The woman who could live comfortably within the limits defined by Miguel's world, accepting his values in exchange for security and status. Or the woman who chose to live according to her own conscience, even when that meant misunderstanding, loneliness, and now, possibly, the loss of the support that kept her work alive. Sophia rose and walked over to the large window. The city stretched out below, a carpet of lights that seemed cold and distant from the elevated height of the apartment. She imagined each light as a life, every lit window as a story of struggle and triumph, pain and joy. Somewhere in that nightscape, children were sleeping in beds that might not be as comfortable as they should be, dreaming dreams that might never fully come true without intervention. And somewhere there, Miguel was probably reviewing documents or planning business strategies, his world as distant from hers as the stars beginning to appear above the city's light pollution. In that nocturnal solitude, Sofia made her choice. Not with fanfare or dramatic declarations, but with a deep quiet that arose from recognizing who she was at the most fundamental level. She could not betray the promise to her father. She could not abandon the children. She could not walk away from the work that gave meaning to every day of her life. The pain of this choice was real, the possibility of losing Miguel, of facing financial hardship, of watching the center close its doors if she could not find alternative support. But the pain of betraying herself would be infinitely greater. At dawn, as the first light of day filtered through the windows Miguel had chosen for their impressive view, Sofia had already decided. She put on her simple clothes, now not just as a work uniform, but as moral armor. Every piece she wore reaffirmed her choices, every worn fabric a silent declaration of loyalty to her values. When Miguel woke and walked into the living room, finding her already dressed, with a quiet determination in her eyes he had never seen before, he knew instantly that something fundamental had changed. Sofia did not need many words. Her posture, her expression, the calm resolve in her gaze said more than any speech could. She would explain her decision, but the essence was already there in the air between them. She had chosen to be faithful to herself, even if it meant walking alone. The choice had been made. And for the first time in weeks, Sofia felt not the weight of doubt or fear of loss, but a strange lightness that came from alignment between who she was and how she chose to live. The pain of possible separation still lay ahead, but for now, there was peace in the decision, and a quiet reward for having chosen authenticity over approval, purpose over comfort, inner truth over outer conformity. The choice Sofia had made with such conviction in that solitary dawn began to reveal its full price in the weeks that followed, a cost far deeper and more multifaceted than she could ever have anticipated in her initial determination. What began as a morally clear decision became a gradual descent into an abyss of unintended consequences, each day bringing new layers of difficulty that tested not only her resolve, but her very sense of self. The first consequence was the most predictable, though no less painful. Miguel moved into an executive hotel, his departure marked by a heavy silence that said more than any argument could. The apartment that had never truly felt like home now became explicitly an empty space, its wide rooms echoing not only with Miguel's absence, but with the disappearance of any real possibility of reconciliation. They lived in very different moral worlds, and her choice had simply brought that truth to the surface in a way that could no longer be ignored. But it was the second consequence that struck at the very heart of the purpose for which Sofia had sacrificed her marriage. The donors who supported the center, many of them connected to Miguel's corporate world, began to withdraw their contributions. The calls started to come in, polite voices explaining new priorities, budget cuts, strategic realignments, all the polished ways people used to say that they no longer wished to be associated with someone who caused discomfort in the social circle of an influential executive. Each lost donation was not just a number in a spreadsheet. It was one less meal for a child, a tutoring session canceled, emotional support withdrawn at exactly the moment it was most needed. The community center, once a vibrant space filled with children's laughter and constant activity, began to show visible signs of strain. Sofia watched the supply shelves empty faster than she could restock them, the waiting list of children in need grow while capacity shrank, the silent worry in the eyes of other volunteers who depended on the center not only as a workplace, but as a source of meaning in their own lives. The third consequence was the most insidious, the social isolation that closed in around Sofia like an invisible dome. Friends who used to invite her to dinner now avoided her, her calls went unanswered, Invitations stopped arriving. She had become an inconvenient presence, someone whose radical choices reminded others of the choices they themselves lacked the courage to make. At the few social gatherings she still attended, she saw the discomfort in people's expressions whenever she mentioned her work, as if the poverty she fought against were a contagious disease from which they needed to protect themselves by keeping their distance. The lowest point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when Sophia received the official notification that they would have to close one of the center's 3 units due to chronic lack of funding. 30 children would lose their daily refuge. 15 families would lose the support that helped keep them stable. An entire community would lose one of the few spaces that offered concrete hope in the midst of rising hardship. She sat in her small office at the main center, rain beating rhythmically against the windows, and cried as she had not cried since her father's death. Her tears were not only for the unit that would close, or for the children they would no longer be able to welcome, or even for the marriage that had crumbled. They were for a fundamental doubt that now haunted her daily. Had I made the right choice? Was my loyalty to my principles worth the destruction of so much good I could do when I was willing to make compromises? The questions echoed in her mind in an endless loop, fed by each lost donation, each child she would now have to turn away, every lonely night in the apartment that felt less like a home and more like a gilded cell built from her own decisions. Her daily routine had become a sad parody of what it once was. She woke in the silent apartment, put on her simple clothes that now felt less like a uniform of purpose and more like a costume of failure, and drove to the center, where she faced, every day, the concrete evidence that her choice might have cost more than it was worth. The children still hugged her, the mothers still thanked her, the volunteers still worked with dedication. But Sophia saw beyond those gestures. She saw the emptier shelves, the longer waiting lists, the fear in the eyes of people who depended on her and whom she might have let down. In this emotional free fall, Sophia questioned everything. Her values, her priorities, her understanding of what it meant to do good in the world. Perhaps Miguel had been right in his pragmatic view. Perhaps she really was sacrificing herself for people who would never fully understand her sacrifice. Perhaps the world worked better when people accepted certain realities instead of trying to challenge them in such a radical way. The loneliness was total, not only physical, but existential. She felt detached not only from Miguel and her former social circle, but from the version of herself who had believed she was stronger, more resilient, more capable of facing the consequences of her choices. The woman who had made that promise to her dying father now seemed like a stranger, a naive idealist who had underestimated the real cost of living according to her principles in a world that rewarded almost exactly the opposite. At the bottom of that fall, when the darkness felt most complete, Sophia faced the most terrifying possibility of all. Maybe she had lost not only her marriage and part of her work, but her own belief that it was still worth fighting for the things in which she believed. The price was revealing itself to be too high, the loneliness too deep, the doubt too corrosive. And for the first time since she had started working at the center, she genuinely did not know whether she would be able to go on, or whether she even should. But at the darkest point of Sophia's emotional free fall, when every new day seemed to demand a Herculean effort and every decision carried the weight of accumulated doubts, something began to change in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like the faint light that precedes sunrise. The transformation did not begin with her, but with Miguel, and it came in a form neither of them could have predicted during those weeks of silence and calculated distance. Miguel began visiting the community center in secret, at first out of a kind of uneasy curiosity. He wanted to understand what could possibly matter so much that Sophia would choose it over him, over the life they had built, over the comfort and status he could provide. His first visits were brief, cautious. He stayed outside, observing through the windows the movement inside that looked chaotic and yet strangely well orchestrated. He saw children running, volunteers smiling. Sophia at the center of it all, not as a distant authority, but as an integral part of that human ecosystem. On his third visit, when he ventured inside at a time he knew Sophia would be at a meeting in another unit, the real change inside him began. A girl of about 7, with big eyes and long eyelashes that contrasted with her simple clothes, approached him without hesitation. "Are you Uncle Miguel?" she asked, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that surprised him in someone so young. Used to negotiating with executives and handling multi-million-dollar contracts, Miguel found himself briefly speechless in the face of such simple directness. "How do you know my name?" he finally managed, his voice softer than he intended. "Aunt Sophia has a picture of you in her drawer," the girl explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She shows it to us when we ask if she is married. She says you are very important, but that you help other people in a different way." The words, spoken with the unfiltered innocence of a child, hit Miguel with a force no argument from Sophia had ever achieved. While he had seen his absence as abandonment, the children saw it as a necessary sacrifice so that he could do his own kind of good in the world. The gap between his perception and the reality described by the girl was the first crack in the solid wall of certainties he had built around himself. In the days that followed, Miguel kept returning, more and more often, and staying longer each time. He began to arrive earlier, to watch not only the activities, but the human interactions that formed the living fabric of the place. He saw Sophia kneeling down to a crying child's height, not with pity, but with genuine empathy. He watched her greet every child by name, knowing their stories, their fears, their dreams. He saw the gratitude in the eyes of mothers who found in the center not just material support, but emotional relief. The crucial moment came on another rainy afternoon, when Miguel witnessed something that completely reshaped his understanding of Sophia's work. A woman arrived at the center with 2 small children, her eyes red from crying, her hands trembling. Sophia received her not with intrusive questions, but with a silent hug that lasted exactly as long as it needed to for the woman to regain a shred of stability. While the children were taken to an activity, Sophia sat with her, listening to her story of job loss, mounting bills, and growing despair. Miguel expected to see conventional charity, a few resources, some generic advice. Instead, he saw Sophia act like a social strategist. She connected the woman with a contact network for job opportunities, organized temporary support for the children, and created a step-by-step plan to get her through the crisis. It was business efficiency applied to human compassion, and Miguel, whose professional life depended on recognizing competence, saw in that moment a mastery that surpassed anything he had encountered in the corporate world. That night, Miguel returned to the executive hotel that served as his temporary home, but his inner world was no longer the same. Pieces started to fall into place. Sophia's simple clothes were not negligence, they were focus. Her work was not a hobby, it was a vocation. Her choice had not been a rejection of him, but an affirmation of who she was in her deepest core. In the silence of that night, Miguel made his own choice. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, not simply to win Sophia back on his terms. He chose because he finally understood something about love he had never grasped before. To truly love someone meant to love who the person really was, not who you wished they would be. And who Sophia truly was, the woman who dedicated her life to reducing the suffering of others, who wore simplicity as a declaration of values, who chose purpose over comfort, was someone worthy not only of his love, but of his genuine admiration. The turning point was not yet complete, but the first movements had begun. And while Sophia continued her daily struggle, unaware of Miguel's secret visits, A quiet transformation was unfolding inside the man she had loved, a transformation that would soon change the course of everything that seemed lost. The darkness was still there, but it now contained the first seeds of a light neither of them yet knew how to recognize, a light beginning to grow in the space between their separate lives, promising a convergence neither would have thought possible just weeks before. The meeting that would change everything did not begin with a grand declaration or dramatic gesture, but with a simple text message Sophia received on an ordinary morning while going over the sender's increasingly desperate accounts. "I need to see you. May I come there?" Miguel's message was brief, but something in its tone, a softness absent from their conversations for weeks, made her heart race with a cautious hope she was afraid to nurture. When he arrived at the center, not in a luxury car, but in a regular taxi, Sophia sensed the first sign that something fundamental had shifted. He walked in wearing casual clothes she recognized from his off-duty wardrobe, not the executive suits he usually wore. His eyes swept through the space, not with the cold judgment of before, but with a visible respect in his posture, in the way he greeted the volunteers, in the attention he gave to the children who surrounded him, curious. "I need to show you something," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had never heard from him. He led her to a small meeting room and opened a folder, not full of corporate documents, but of photographs, pictures he had secretly taken during his visits to the center. Images of smiling children, relieved mothers, and Sophia working with an intensity he now saw not as obsession, but as true passion. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words coming with visible effort from someone not used to acknowledging mistakes. "I thought you were choosing these children over me, over us. But it is not about choosing. It is about who you are. And I want to be part of this, if you will let me." The proposal he made next was as radical as the choice Sophia had made weeks earlier. He did not suggest a return to their old relationship. He did not offer a vague compromise. He proposed something far more concrete and transformative, selling the luxury car that symbolized everything he had valued before and donating the full amount to save the center. "Not as an empty gesture," he explained, "but as my first real step into this world you have created. I want to learn what you already know about what truly matters." The scene at the dealership, when they returned together a few days later, was a study in contrasts with Sophia's original humiliation. This time, Miguel walked in first, still dressed simply, and asked to speak to the manager. When the same salesman who had humiliated Sophia approached, his condescending smile froze as he recognized Miguel, not as a poorly dressed customer, but as the executive whose photograph he had seen in business magazines. But Miguel did not seek revenge or payback. Instead, he calmly explained to the manager that he was there to sell the car, not as a typical transaction, but as part of a significant donation to the community center his wife ran. His words were clear, but not accusatory. "I have recently learned that real value is not found in what we drive, but in what we drive ourselves to do in the world." The manager and sales team, defensive at first, gradually shifted not only to cooperation, but to genuine admiration. One of them, the same man who had made the comment about dreams that do not sell cars on Sophia's first visit, apologized, not out of obligation, but with visible shame. "I judged you by your appearance," he confessed, "and I was completely wrong." The sale went through with a speed that surprised even Miguel, but the real miracle happened afterward, when the money reached the center's account. It did not just save the unit that was about to close. It allowed the reopening of the one that had already been shut down, and the planning of a fourth location. The amount, the equivalent of an entire year of the center's operation, represented not only financial salvation, but a moral validation of the work Sophia had carried out for years in the face of so much skepticism. Yet the most profound transformation occurred not in the center's financial health, nor in the dynamics of the dealership, but within Sophia and Miguel's relationship itself. Miguel began volunteering regularly at the center, awkwardly at first, but with genuine dedication that quickly won over children and staff alike. He learned to read stories to groups of children, to organize donations, to use his business skills to create more efficient systems for managing resources. Sophia, in turn, saw not only the husband she had loved, but a man who was becoming someone she had never imagined he could be, someone who now found meaning not in financial transactions, but in human connection, not in status, but in service. They did not return to the relationship they had had before, because that relationship was built on false assumptions and incompatible values. Instead, they built something new, more authentic, based on mutual respect for who each of them truly was, and on values they now shared. Sophia's simple clothes never changed. She continued to wear them, not out of need, but out of conviction. But now, when she walked into places where she had once been judged, she did so not only with the quiet dignity she had always possessed, but with the assurance of knowing there was someone beside her who finally understood the meaning woven into every worn thread. Miguel, in his turn, discovered that the simplicity he had once dismissed now gave him a deeper satisfaction than any luxury purchase ever had. The final lesson was not about revenge for humiliation, or about hidden financial power, or even about charity in a conventional sense. It was about something much deeper. That true love sometimes demands that we transform ourselves in order to align with the values of the person we love. That the most radical generosity is not giving what we have left over, but letting go of what we once thought essential in order to embrace what truly is. And that sometimes the greatest transformations begin not with grand gestures, but with the humility to admit that we were wrong about what really matters. Sophia and Miguel did not live happily ever after in the fairy tale sense. Real life is far too complex for endings that simple. But they lived authentically, together, building not only a community center that transformed lives, but a relationship that had transformed them both. In the end, they proved that even the most painful humiliations can give birth to the deepest understandings, and that true worth never lies in what we possess, but in what we are willing to give up in order to become who we are truly meant to be.